Behind the old water tower, past the edge of what was once the most ambitious psychiatric institution ever built, there is a cemetery. It is not marked the way cemeteries usually are. There are no family names carved into the stone, no dates of birth etched beneath a cross, no flowers left by people who still remember. The headstones here carry numbers, just numbers, assigned at death, recorded in a ledger, and driven into the ground above whoever happened to be buried there. These were the patients who died at Pilgrim State Hospital and had no one left to claim them. The institution logged them, assigned them a number, and returned them to the earth the same way it had processed them in life, efficiently, anonymously, without ceremony. In the late 1930s, before the population swelled past anything its architects had imagined possible, Pilgrim was averaging 1 death per day. And this was not yet the worst of it. At its peak, Pilgrim State Hospital held 13,875 patients, making it the single largest psychiatric hospital on the face of the earth. Not the largest in New York, not the largest in America, on Earth. It was bigger than most towns, and it functioned like one, except that almost no one inside it had chosen to be there. The question worth asking, the question those numbered stones demand, is how a place built with this much conviction, this much scale, this much stated purpose, became what it became. To answer that, we have to go back to the beginning. Chapter 1. The Crisis That Built a City. To understand what Pilgrim was, you first have to understand what New York was becoming. By the turn of the 20th century, the city was transforming at a pace that defied any single institution's ability to keep up. Immigration was accelerating. The population was climbing toward figures that would have seemed impossible a generation earlier. And with that growth came everything that follows it: poverty, displacement, overcrowding, and the particular kind of psychological fracture that accumulates in human beings when the world moves faster than they can adapt to it. The mentally ill had always existed. What changed was the number of them that the state could no longer ignore. New York's psychiatric asylums, most of them built in the previous century, with a fraction of the capacity now required, were failing under the weight of demand. Wards designed for 40 patients held 80. Corridors became sleeping quarters. Staff who had been hired to provide care found themselves instead managing crowds, trying to maintain basic order in facilities that had long since passed the point of being able to offer anything resembling treatment. Patients who arrived in crisis stayed in crisis because there was nowhere to put them, no time to attend to them, and no real system for moving them forward. The asylum had become a warehouse, and the warehouse was full. The state's first response had been the farm colony model. The logic behind it was genuinely idealistic, almost utopian in its ambition. Rather than confining the mentally ill in crowded urban institutions surrounded by noise and density, New York would relocate them to the countryside. Fresh air, open land, productive labor. The theory, which had currency in psychiatric thinking of the era, held that work had therapeutic value, that routine, physical effort, and proximity to nature could stabilize minds that the city had fractured. Kings Park State Hospital on the north shore of Long Island and Central Islip State Hospital to the south were the first expressions of this idea. Both opened in the late 19th century. Both were built on substantial acreage. Both were designed to be largely self-sufficient, farming their own food, housing their own staff, operating as communities unto themselves rather than as appendages of the urban system they were meant to relieve. And for a time, the model held. But the city kept growing. The demand kept rising, and the farm colonies, built to absorb what had once seemed like an unmanageable number of patients, began to fill at the same rate as the institutions they had been designed to replace. By the 1920s, Kings Park and Central Islip were themselves overcrowded. The solution had become the problem. And now, the problem needed a new solution. In 1927, New York Governor Alfred Smith brought the matter before the state legislature with unusual directness. The situation, he argued, was not a bureaucratic inconvenience. It was a crisis. The state needed a minimum of 10,000 new beds, and it needed them built into a facility capable of sustaining itself without constant infusion of urban resources. The legislature agreed, the appropriation was made, and the search began for a place large enough to hold what New York could no longer contain. The answer was Brentwood, 1,000 acres of flat open farmland in the middle of Long Island, cheap, remote, and far enough from the city to make the founding philosophy viable again. The land was purchased by the state, and construction began in 1929. What was being built was not simply a hospital. It was a self-contained world, one capable of generating its own electricity, purifying its own water, processing its own waste, growing a portion of its own food, and housing the staff who would operate it. A place that would not need the city because it was designed never to have to ask anything of it. The institution was named for Dr. Charles W. Pilgrim, the Commissioner of Mental Hygiene in New York in the early years of the 20th century, a figure whose career had been defined by the effort to bring order and humanity to a psychiatric system that had long operated without enough of either. It was, in retrospect, a quietly ironic choice of name. Pilgrim the man had spent his career advocating for better conditions for the mentally ill. The institution that bore his name would, in time, become a monument to the limits of that aspiration. But in 1929, none of that was yet visible. What was visible was the construction, the laying of foundations across 1,000 acres of Long Island farmland, the erection of institutional structures across a campus that would eventually stretch to the horizon in every direction. For the patients who would eventually be sent there, the distance from the city was not abstract. It was physical and final. To be committed to a state hospital on Long Island in that era was to be removed from your neighborhood, from your family, from whatever life you had assembled before the crisis came. The train ride out from the city carried you past the point where the buildings thinned and the trees began, past the point where the streets had names you recognized, and deposited you on a platform built specifically for this purpose, in a place that had been constructed specifically to hold you. The fields were quiet, the air was clean, and for most of the people who arrived, that was the last they would see of the world outside. Chapter 2: A Town Without a Choice. On October 1st, 1931, 100 patients were transferred from Central Islip State Hospital to the newly completed grounds of Pilgrim State Hospital in Brentwood. They arrived by train on a rail line built specifically to service the institution, and were received into a campus that was still, in many ways, finding its shape. The buildings were new, the grounds were raw, the full machinery of the place had not yet fully turned over. 9 months later, 2,018 patients were hospitalized at Pilgrim. The speed of that growth tells you something essential about the pressure the institution had been built to absorb. There was no gradual settling in period, no careful calibration of capacity against need. The need was already there, fully formed, waiting. Pilgrim opened its doors, and the doors were immediately crowded. What those first patients arrived into was unlike anything that had existed before in American psychiatry, not because of its treatment philosophy, which was inherited from the agrarian model that had preceded it, but because of its sheer completeness as a built environment. Pilgrim State Hospital was not designed to function as a dependency of the outside world. It was designed to function instead of it. The infrastructure assembled on those 1,000 acres was staggering in its scope. There was a power plant that generated the institution's own electricity, a waterworks that drew and purified its own supply, a sewage system that processed its own waste, a heating plant, laundry, greenhouses that extended the growing season for crops that the farm itself produced, and a Long Island Railroad station, a dedicated platform on the main line built to receive patients arriving from the city and staff arriving from their homes, and to occasionally carry both back out again. Beneath all of it ran a network of tunnels. These underground passages connected the buildings across the campus, routing utilities through the ground and providing covered corridors for the movement of patients and staff in all weather. The tunnels were practical, but they also gave the institution a quality that was difficult to name precisely. Above ground, Pilgrim looked like a collection of solid buildings arranged across open land. Below ground, it was all connected, a single organism with many rooms. The buildings themselves followed a deliberate architectural logic. They were organized into quads, groupings of 4 residential buildings arranged around a central structure that housed the kitchen. Each quad was its own small ecosystem, with patients eating communally in the central building and spending their days in the surrounding 4. It was a system designed for efficiency and supervision, and it scaled. As the population grew, new quads were added, the campus spreading outward from its original core, like rings from a stone dropped in still water. That expansion eventually crossed municipal boundaries in ways that had no real precedent. Over the years following its opening, as Pilgrim acquired additional land and constructed additional buildings, the campus grew until it reached into 4 separate townships of Suffolk County: Babylon, Huntington, Islip, and Smithtown. 2 state roads eventually ran directly through the hospital grounds. This was not a building that sat in a town. This was a campus large enough to contain parts of several towns simultaneously, with public infrastructure threading through it as though the institution and the surrounding communities had grown into each other without either fully intending to. The society that formed around Pilgrim mirrored this complexity. The institution employed thousands of people: doctors, nurses, attendants, administrators, groundskeepers, farmers, electricians, cooks, laundry workers, police officers, firefighters. Many of them lived on the grounds in staff housing built specifically for that purpose. There were neighborhoods within the campus where employees raised families, where children grew up in the shadow of the wards, where a kind of domestic life unfolded alongside the institutional one. People married and had children and attended the campus church and collected their mail from the campus post office and lived, in many ways, entirely within the world Pilgrim had constructed around them. It was, by any measure, a functioning community, and that is precisely what made it so strange. Because the central fact of Pilgrim was that the majority of the people living there had not chosen to be there. The patients who filled the wards had been committed, some by family, some by courts, some by a medical system that had reached the limits of what it could offer and deposited them here as the next available option. They lived within this complete self-sufficient world, surrounded by its infrastructure and its routines and its careful architecture of daily life, and they had no claim on any of it. The farm still needed tending, the laundry still needed running, the kitchen still needed staffing, and in the early decades of the institution's life, it was frequently the patients themselves who provided that labor. Working the land, maintaining the grounds, performing the tasks that kept the organism functioning. This was the original vision in practice: work as treatment, contribution as therapy. Whether it helped anyone is a question the institution never fully answered. What is certain is that Pilgrim grew, steadily, relentlessly, absorbing more patients, acquiring more land, adding more buildings, becoming more complete and more self-enclosed with each passing year. A town without a mayor, a community without a choice, a world unto itself, expanding at the edge of Long Island farmland, filling with people the city had decided it could no longer hold. Chapter 3. The world outside looks in. Pilgrim had barely settled into its identity when the world intervened. In the years following its opening, the campus had continued to grow. More patients, more buildings, more infrastructure added to what was already the most self-contained psychiatric institution in the country. By the late 1930s, it was a city within a city, absorbing the overflow of a state system that had never quite caught up with demand. And then, in December of 1941, the United States entered the Second World War, and the federal government began looking at large, functional, self-sufficient campuses with a very different set of needs in mind. The War Department requisitioned Edgewood State Hospital, along with 3 buildings on the Pilgrim campus itself, designated Buildings 81, 82, and 83. These structures were removed from the authority of the New York State Department of Mental Hygiene and placed under military control. They were renamed Mason General Hospital, and their purpose was entirely distinct from the institution they now neighbored. Mason General was a military psychiatric facility. Its patients were not the chronic long-term commitments that filled Pilgrim's wards, the men and women who had arrived years or decades earlier and had not left. Its patients were soldiers, men who had come back from combat theaters in Europe and the Pacific, carrying something the military called, variously, combat fatigue, shell shock, or battle neurosis. The contrast between what was happening on the 2 sides of that shared campus was sharp enough to be uncomfortable, even at the time. The soldiers at Mason General were treated with urgency. Resources were directed toward their recovery. The goal was rehabilitation, returning men to functioning lives, ideally to active duty, and if not that, then to civilian life with some restored capacity for stability. Treatment was active, intentional, and oriented toward an outcome. Across the fence, Pilgrim's civilian patients continued as they had been, moving through days structured around management rather than recovery, tended by chronically understaffed teams and wards that had grown too large for the founding vision to reach. The contrast was not lost on those who witnessed both sides of it. What it revealed, quietly and without any official acknowledgement, was a hierarchy of whose suffering the state considered worth addressing with urgency, and whose it had learned to simply administer. The filmmaker John Huston, serving under a special commission in the United States Army Signal Corps, came to Mason General during the war years to document what combat had done to the men who fought it. The film he produced, called Let There Be Light, was completed in 1946. The Army then withheld it from public release for 35 years. The stated reason was patient privacy, but the deeper discomfort ran further than consent procedures. Let There Be Light showed soldiers weeping. It showed men unable to speak, paralyzed by experiences the military preferred to frame as failures of individual fortitude rather than as injuries sustained in service. A film that placed mental illness inside a uniform was a film the institution of the military was not prepared to release into the world. It finally reached public audiences in 1981, long after most of the men it documented had lived out whatever came next for them. The war ended. The buildings were returned to Pilgrim. Mason General was disbanded, and the military's presence on the campus dissolved as completely as it had arrived, leaving behind no lasting program, no infrastructure the civilian institution was invited to adopt, no model that survived the handover. What it left behind was a vacancy, and into that vacancy, in the years immediately following the armistice, came a surge of new patients that would push Pilgrim past every boundary it had ever been designed to hold. Chapter 4: The Peak. The years immediately following the Second World War brought to Pilgrim State Hospital something that no one inside the institution was fully prepared to absorb: a wave. The men who came back from Europe and the Pacific came back changed, and not all of them came back whole. The social machinery that was supposed to receive them did not always hold. Some men returned to find that the world had moved without them. Others returned carrying something that had no name in the civilian vocabulary, something that made ordinary life feel distant and unnavigable. And behind them came the broader pressures of a post-war society reorganizing itself at speed. The strains of displacement, of poverty, of families fractured by years of separation, of a medical system still operating with a fraction of the psychiatric understanding it would eventually develop. The commitment numbers rose, and they kept rising. By 1954, Pilgrim State Hospital held 13,875 patients. Approximately 4,000 staff members worked alongside them: doctors, nurses, attendants, administrators, groundskeepers, kitchen workers, laundry operators, police, and all the other categories of employee required to sustain an institution of this complexity. When you add those figures together, the total population on the Pilgrim campus at its peak was approaching 18,000 people. 18,000, that number needs to be set against something to be felt properly. In 1954, the entire population of Brentwood, the town in which Pilgrim sat, was smaller than the number of patients alone inside the hospital's gates. Pilgrim was not situated in a community. It had become one, a designation in the record books that no institution built since has come close to challenging. The founding vision, the idea that had animated the institution from its first groundbreaking, that patients could be stabilized and perhaps restored through agricultural labor and open air and the dignity of productive work, did not survive contact with these numbers. It could not have. The philosophy had been designed for hundreds, perhaps for a few thousand. It had no coherent application at 14,000. You cannot organize the therapeutic farming of crops around a population larger than most small cities. You cannot maintain the pretense of restorative community when the community in question requires the logistical infrastructure of a small municipality simply to feed and house and clothe itself each day. What replaced the philosophy was management. The wards were filled, the beds were filled. In some cases, the spaces between the beds were filled. Attendants responsible for dozens of patients simultaneously could not provide the sustained individual attention that any meaningful treatment would have required. the institution's purpose shifted by degrees and without any single decision being made from treatment to containment. Pilgrim became, in its peak years, what the overcrowded city asylums of the early 1900s had been, a holding place for people the broader society had determined it could not accommodate. Among the nearly 14,000 patients inside Pilgrim's walls during its peak years was a woman named Naomi Ginsburg. She had been born in Russia in 1894 and had come to America as a child, eventually settling in Newark, New Jersey, where she married and raised a family. She suffered from schizophrenia throughout most of her adult life, a condition that was managed in the way such conditions were managed in that era, through a series of institutionalizations that grew longer and more permanent as the years passed. She spent extended periods at Pilgrim. She died there in 1956. Her son was the poet Allen Ginsberg, and 2 years before her death, he had written and published a poem called Howl, a long, cascading, furious document of mid-century American life that named Pilgrim State Hospital explicitly. The line lands in the poem the way the name lands in reality, as a destination, as a terminus, as the place where certain lives were sent when the world outside decided it had no further use for them. Naomi Ginsburg is one name from the peak years, one name attached to one story, documented because of who her son became. The others beside her are not documented in any way that has survived to be read. They are the ward assignments and the admission numbers and the ledger entries. Not all of them were severely ill by any clinical standard. The mid-20th century's definition of who required institutionalization was broader and more elastic than anything that would be recognized as legitimate today. Women committed by husbands for behavior that was inconvenient rather than dangerous. Men institutionalized for tendencies that ran against the social grain. People whose poverty or unconventional lives had been coded by a physician as evidence of mental disorder. The institution did not ask many questions about the circumstances of commitment. Its gates opened inward, and once inside, the architecture of the place did not particularly encourage movement in the other direction. To enter Pilgrim at its peak was, for most people, to stay. The average length of stay during these years was not measured in weeks or months. It was measured in years, in decades. Some patients who arrived in the 1930s were still there in the 1950s, having lived the entirety of their middle age within the same complex, tended by rotating staffs who may or may not have learned their names. The institution had taken them in. It had become their world because it had made itself into the only world available to them. 13,875 patients in 1954, at the farthest point from anything it had ever claimed to be. Chapter 5, Building 23. There is a building that no longer exists at Pilgrim State Hospital. It was called Building 23, and before it was demolished, it stood as one of the more substantial structures on the campus, institutional, indistinguishable from the dozens of other numbered buildings that surrounded it, except for one detail. On the uppermost floor of Building 23, there was an operating room. It overlooked the whole of the campus. From its windows on a clear day, you could see the full breadth of what Pilgrim had become, the quad clusters spreading outward in every direction, the water tower, the tunnel entrances, the fields, the church, the power plant stacks. The entire world of the institution laid out below, visible from a single room at the top of a single building. Whether the architects intended that vantage point to mean something is not recorded, but it is difficult not to read it as a kind of symbol, the operating room above everything. Looking down, it was here, according to available historical accounts, that an estimated 1,500 or more patients underwent prefrontal lobotomies during the 1940s and 1950s. That figure comes from secondary sources and should be understood as an estimate. Pilgrim did not publicize a running count, and the institutional records that might have produced a precise number have not been made comprehensively available. But the estimate is consistent with what is known about the scale of the lobotomy program in American psychiatric hospitals during this period, and with the size of Pilgrim's patient population. 1,500 procedures spread across 2 decades, in an institution holding tens of thousands of patients. To understand how this happened, you have to understand the position of the psychiatrist in the middle of the 20th century. Not as we see that position now, from the far side of decades of pharmacological and therapeutic development, but as it actually was in 1945 or 1950. The tools available were few and largely ineffective. The wards were full of people in acute and chronic distress, people who could not be reached through conversation, who could not be stabilized through any available medication, who posed dangers to themselves and to others in ways that the staff around them had no reliable means of addressing. The institution was not indifferent to the suffering it contained. It was, in many cases, desperate for something that worked. The lobotomy had arrived from Europe with the endorsement of the international medical establishment. The Portuguese neurologist Egas Moniz had developed the procedure in the 1930s, and in 1949 was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for his work. This was not fringe medicine. This was recognized science, arriving at a moment when American psychiatry had very little else to offer its most unreachable patients. The procedure spread accordingly. By the late 1940s, it had been adopted in psychiatric hospitals across the United States, including Pilgrim, and it was described in the language of mercy. For patients who were violent, who were lost to the institution and to themselves, who had no prospect of discharge and no capacity for engagement that any alternative treatment would have required, the operation offered the possibility of stillness, of something that could be mistaken from a distance for peace. What it actually produced in many cases was a different kind of loss. The horror of the lobotomy does not live in its mechanics. It lives in what happened afterward, in the patients who emerged from the operating room in Building 23, no longer violent, no longer unreachable, but also no longer fully present. People who had been difficult, who had been suffering, who had been alive with the terrible energy of their illness, diminished by the intervention of a surgeon to something quieter and emptier and less. The procedure did not restore anyone to themselves. In the cases where it appeared to succeed, it succeeded by removing the parts of the self that had been causing the problem. This is not healing, it is subtraction. Electroconvulsive therapy was running parallel to the lobotomy program during the same decades. It was used more broadly, on a wider range of patients, and with less permanence in its effects. It too was administered at Pilgrim as part of the institutional effort to manage a population that available science had not yet learned to genuinely treat. The clearest available record of what these treatments cost at Pilgrim is the case of Beulah Jones. She was a patient at the hospital from 1952 to 1972, 20 years inside the same institution. During that time, she received both a lobotomy and electroconvulsive therapy. She emerged from both treatments seriously impaired, not calmed, not stabilized in any meaningful clinical sense. Impaired. The woman who had entered Pilgrim in 1952 was not the woman who was eventually discharged 20 years later, and the distance between those two people had been created, at least in part, by the treatments the institution had administered in the name of her care. Her case is documented while most are not. The moral question that hangs over Building 23 is not whether the doctors who worked in its operating room were monsters. Most of them were not. They were physicians operating within the consensus of their era, using tools that the scientific establishment had validated, on patients whom every other available approach had failed to reach. The question that is harder to answer is at what point the institution understood that what it was doing was causing harm, and what it chose to do with that understanding. The answer, in the case of Pilgrim, is not recorded with any particular clarity. The program continued through the 1940s and into the 1950s. It wound down not because of an internal reckoning, but because better alternatives eventually arrived to replace it. By the time those alternatives came, Building 23 had served its purpose. The operating room on the uppermost floor was closed. The equipment was removed, stripped eventually by scrappers after the building fell into abandonment. The walls had blackened. The room that had once looked out over the whole of the campus sat empty, stripped of everything that had made it what it was, its function legible only to those who already knew its history. Building 23 has been razed. The operating room, the morgue gone, and the inscription on the wall are all gone. The physical evidence of what happened in that building has been demolished and cleared, and the ground where it stood has been left empty. Institutions, it turns out, are permitted to forget a great deal. Chapter 6: The Pharmaceutical Reprieve. The thing that ended Pilgrim's era as the world's dominant psychiatric institution was not a scandal. It was not a government investigation or a court order or a public uprising, though all of those things would come in time, in various forms, to various institutions across the country. What ended it, first and most fundamentally, was a pill. In the mid-1950s, a new class of medication began to move through American psychiatric hospitals. Chlorpromazine was the first of what would become known as antipsychotic drugs, and its arrival in the wards of institutions like Pilgrim produced effects that the entire preceding apparatus of treatment had failed to achieve. Patients who had been unreachable became reachable. Symptoms that had seemed permanent became manageable. People who had been committed on the understanding that they would never leave found themselves, for the first time, in a condition that made leaving thinkable. The transformation was genuine. This is worth stating plainly because it is easy, in the context of everything else that happened inside Pilgrim's walls, to be cynical about any claim the institution or its era might make about progress. But the pharmacological revolution of the mid-1950s was real, and its effects on the lives of people with severe psychiatric conditions were, in many cases, profound. It did not cure anyone. It did not resolve the underlying conditions that had brought patients to Pilgrim in the first place. What it did was restore, to a significant portion of the population, a degree of stability that made life outside an institution conceivable. The man who presided over this transformation at Pilgrim was Henry Brill, who became director of the hospital in 1958 and held that position until 1974. Brill was an administrator and a clinician, methodical, oriented toward outcomes, less interested in ideology than in what the data showed. And what the data showed, across his 16 years at the helm of Pilgrim, was an institution in accelerating contraction, measured not in failure but in discharge, patients leaving, wards emptying, the population falling year by year as the medication did what the operating room in Building 23 had never managed to do. This is the part of the story that is most frequently told as triumph, the liberation of the institutionalized, the dismantling of the containment system, the return of thousands of people to their communities and their lives. And there is truth in that telling. Deinstitutionalization did return a great many people to lives that were fuller and more autonomous than anything Pilgrim had been able to offer them. But the complete picture is considerably darker. The community infrastructure that was supposed to receive the discharged patients, the outpatient clinics, the supported housing programs, the social services, the networks of care that would allow people with serious psychiatric conditions to live outside an institution without simply being abandoned, did not exist at the scale required. It had been discussed. It had been legislated, in parts. But the legislation had moved considerably faster than the actual construction of the systems. When the wards emptied, many of the people who left Pilgrim's gates walked into a world that had no adequate place for them. Some found their way. Some returned to families who were able to support them. Some rebuilt lives with the assistance of the medications that had made discharge possible. But others did not. Others cycled through emergency rooms and shelters and brief readmissions and periods of homelessness and back again, trapped in a pattern that would come to define urban life in America for decades. The deinstitutionalized, visible on the streets of cities that had dismantled the institutions without building the replacements. The campus contracted around its diminishing population. Buildings were closed and shuttered, their contents left as they were when the last patient was moved out. Nature began its patient work on the empty structures, water finding its way through aging rooflines, vegetation pressing against foundations, the institutional structures beginning the slow process of returning to the landscape they had been built upon. In December of 1971, Edgewood State Hospital closed its doors permanently. It was the first of the Long Island farm colonies to fall, and its closure was a preview of what was coming for the others. The public perception of Pilgrim was shifting alongside its population. In 1985, a film called Murder, by Reason of Insanity, was shot on the grounds of Pilgrim State Hospital. The film was based on the case of Adam Bearwood, a patient who had been granted a day pass from the institution and, while outside its gates, committed a crime that became a focal point for public debate about discharge policies, about what obligations an institution had to the community when it released a patient into it, and about the distance between the formal procedures of deinstitutionalization and its practical consequences. that a film production chose Pilgrim's grounds as the physical setting for a story about institutional failure was not incidental. The campus by 1985 looked the part. It had the atmosphere of a place where something had gone wrong, not recently, but over a long time, in ways that had accumulated without resolution. The reprieve that the pharmaceuticals had offered was real, but it was also only a reprieve. The population had been released, the institution remained, and the question of what to do with what was left had not yet been answered. Chapter 7. Closing time on Long Island. By the early 1990s, the 3 remaining psychiatric hospitals on Long Island were operating at a fraction of their former capacity, sustaining themselves on institutional inertia and state funding that was increasingly difficult to justify against their diminished populations. The era that had begun with such confidence at the turn of the century was ending not with any dramatic reckoning, but with the quiet arithmetic of bureaucratic consolidation. The New York State Office of Mental Health looked at 3 large campuses, each expensive to maintain, each holding a patient population that could be served by one, and made the decision that institutions in decline tend eventually to force. In 1995, Pilgrim State Hospital was renamed Pilgrim Psychiatric Center. It was an administrative adjustment, a modernization of language intended to signal a different kind of institution than the word hospital had come to imply. The renaming changed nothing structural. The buildings were the same buildings. The history was the same history. The cemetery behind the water tower held the same numbered stones it had always held. A new name on the letterhead could not reach any of that. In the fall of 1996, Kings Park Psychiatric Center and Central Islip Psychiatric Center were formally closed. Their remaining patients were transferred to Pilgrim or discharged into community care. The campuses they left behind became, almost immediately, the kinds of places that abandonment produces, large, deteriorating, scaled to a population that no longer existed. Kings Park's buildings were left largely standing, a sprawling monument to institutional decay on the North Shore. Central Islip moved toward redevelopment more quickly, portions of its campus eventually becoming a college and a residential development. Pilgrim absorbed the remnants of the Long Island psychiatric system and became its sole survivor. The last of the farm colonies standing, though standing now, as a much reduced and purposefully narrowed version of what it had once been. It had begun as a solution to overcrowding, and had ended by receiving the overflow of institutions that were themselves being closed. The arc had come full circle, and the circle was considerably smaller than anyone who had broken ground in 1929 could have imagined. In 2002, a developer named Gerald Wolkoff purchased 462 acres of the former Pilgrim property for $21 million. He announced plans for a $4 billion mixed-use development to be called Heartland Town Center. Residential buildings, office space, commercial infrastructure, a new community built on the cleared ground of the old one. In preparation, demolitions began in 2003. The old medical and surgical buildings came down. The male and female admissions buildings came down. The administration building came down in 2012. The development that was supposed to replace them did not come. The cleared ground sat empty. Where buildings had stood for 80 years, where tens of thousands of people had lived and worked and been treated and died, there was now open land waiting for a future that had been announced but not built. The farm colony was gone. The ambition that had replaced it was stalled. And what remained of Pilgrim sat at the center of all of it, smaller, reduced, and still carrying everything the name had come to mean. Chapter 8. The Place Where Death Delights. In Building 45, on the still functioning portion of the Pilgrim campus, there was a museum. The Long Island Psychiatric Museum had assembled, over the years, a collection of photographs and relics and institutional artifacts drawn from all 3 of the Long Island farm colonies, Kings Park, Central Islip, and Pilgrim itself. Newsletters from the peak years, equipment from the wards, images of the patients and the staff and the buildings at every stage of the institution's life. It was, in its way, an act of memory, an acknowledgement that what had happened on this campus and the ones surrounding it was worth preserving, worth understanding, worth not simply demolishing and forgetting along with the buildings. On November 5, 2020, Building 45 flooded. The water destroyed most of the collection. The institution's own archive was nearly erased by a single night of water. What had survived decades of institutional transformation, consolidation, and demolition did not survive a rainstorm. Some of the collection has been restored, much of it has not. It is difficult not to read that flood as a completion of a pattern that had been running through the Pilgrim story from the beginning. The record of what happened here has been, repeatedly and in different forms, returned to silence. Across the road from the still operating hospital, on the acreage that once comprised the working farm at the heart of the institution's founding philosophy, sits Suffolk County Community College. The fields where patients worked the land through the 1930s and 1940s now hold lecture halls and parking lots and the ordinary infrastructure of a commuter campus. Students move through those grounds every day without any particular reason to know what the ground once was. The irony is not angry. It is unremarked and complete. The water tower still stands, and behind it, the cemetery remains as it has always been, the headstones carrying their numbers, the names they replaced unrecorded in any form that has survived. We began there, at those stones, with a question. How does a place built with this much ambition become a field of numbered graves? The answer, assembled from everything that came before this moment, is not simple enough to fit in a sentence. It is the answer of a system that confused scale with capability, that grew beyond the reach of its own founding ideals, that administered harm and administered care through the same institutional machinery in the same buildings, often at the same time. The inscription that was painted on the tile wall in the morgue below Building 23 described itself as the place where death delights to help the living. It was a traditional medical maxim, meaning that the study of those who have died serves the understanding of those who remain. But read against the full history of this campus, it arrives differently. The place that was built to help the living became, for thousands of people, something it was never designed or intended to be. Pilgrim was not built by people who meant harm. It was built by a state responding to a genuine crisis, run by people who believed, in many cases sincerely, in the purpose of what they were doing. The compassion was real, the harm was also real. Both lived in the same buildings, moved through the same tunnels, were sustained by the same infrastructure. The history of Pilgrim does not resolve into a clean verdict because the institution itself never did. It was too large, lasted too long, and held too many people for any single characterization to hold. What remains is the water tower, the numbered stones behind it, the silence of a campus that once held close to 18,000 people and now holds a fraction of that number. The patients who died here and had no one to claim them were assigned numbers and returned to the earth. The numbers are what the record kept when it let the names go. They are still there in a field most people driving past on the state road will never think to look for. They were not statistics when they arrived. They were not statistics when they died. The institution made them numbers. The least that memory can do is refuse to do the same.